Good afternoon. My name is Brian Leib. I'm the Executive Director of the Iranian Americans for Liberty, and I'm currently sitting in IAL studios in Washington, D.C. On behalf of our Board of Directors, our Board of Advisors, and our supporters all around the nation, please allow me to welcome all of you to our final event of 2021. Throughout this year, we've hosted 16 virtual congressional meet and greets with members of Congress, and 10 webinars featuring members of the Iranian American community, foreign policy experts, and human rights experts. Today's webinar will focus on the human rights violations that occur on a weekly basis in the Islamic Republic of Iran. Before we get started, though, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about our organization and then some more information on today's very special guest. The Iranian Americans for Liberty are a bipartisan group of Iranian Americans from all around the nation that are working together to support and strengthen U.S. foreign policy and national security solutions that bring democracy, human rights accountability, freedom of speech to Iranians living under the oppressive Islamic Republic of Iran. Please visit our website at www.iranianamericans4liberty.org to learn a little bit more about our organization. So that's a little bit more about the Iranian Americans for Liberty. And at this time, I want to kick the program off by introducing this afternoon's special guest. But before doing that, I'm going to read a very short bio about our guest. Dr. Farhad Rezaei is a senior research fellow with the Philos Project. And the Philos Project is a dynamic leadership community that is dedicated to promoting positive Christian engagement in the Near East. Dr. Rezaei's work at the Philos Project focuses on the Islamic Republic of Iran and the violations against religious minorities in the Middle East. He is the author of numerous books and articles on Iran's foreign and defense policies. His writings have appeared in the prestigious journals, including the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, Harvard Iran Matters, Middle East Policy, The National Interest, Center for International Policy Studies, the Journal of International Affairs, The Hill, The Providence, and Bisa Center, among others. His latest project is a book titled Iran's War on Israel, Taking Down the Little Satan. So, Dr. Rezaei, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, and I'd like to turn it over to you for some brief opening remarks before we jump into our Q&A. So thank you again. The floor is yours, sir.
Thanks for having me, Brian. It's a pleasure to be with you here.
Perfect. So let's jump right into our first question. And let's talk about the discrimination and the violence that women, ethnic and religious minorities face in the Islamic Republic of Iran. So many Americans don't know that women are considered to be half of a man in the courts from a legal perspective in the Islamic Republic. In addition, women cannot attend sports games, they cannot sing in public, and they are forced to wear a hijab. And regarding religious minorities, such as the Baha'i, which are not recognized as a religious minority by the Islamic Republic of Iran, they are routinely harassed and prosecuted and imprisoned, the Baha'i are, solely for practicing their faith. And they also regularly have their places of burials destroyed. The Islamic Republic of Iran also prevents Baha'i students from registering in universities, and they expel those that are adherent to this faith. So, Dr. Rezaei, let's start with that question, and I hope you could speak to that topic a little bit, please.
Thanks very much, Brian, for this question. Yes, the Iranian regime's systematic discrimination against women and treating them as a second-class citizens is well known. The Iranian regime treats women within the bounds of Islamic law or Sharia law and does not recognize the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and does not recognize any rights for women beyond Sharia law, which basically leaves women with almost zero rights. The Iranian regime harasses women, jails them, inspires violence against women, and flogs them for appearing in public without Islamic hijab, punishing them in judicial system, denies their political right, denies their economic opportunities. So mistreatment of women represents a fundamental component of the Iranian regime's religious authority. You might be surprised if you hear that the new censorship law prevents broadcasters showing women doing some certain things on TV, like, for example, like eating pizza and sandwich, or drinking any beverage in red color on a screen. Women should not, for example, wear leather gloves. That's the Iranian regime, and that's the way it treats women. Now, when it comes to the treatment of ethnic and religious minorities and discrimination against these minorities, especially Baha'is, as you mentioned, Christians and Jews, the Iranian regime has a terrible record. Iran's constitution only recognizes Zoroastrians, Jews, and Christians as the only recognized religious minorities. But the other religious minorities are totally ignored. And, but the reality is that Christians, along with Baha'is and Sunnis, as I said, they are recognized in the Iranian constitution as religious minorities, but they have been the most persecuted by the Islamic regime in Iran. They are subject to numerous rules and regulations, and their religious rights have been violated. Baha'is and Christians, including Christian converts, they have been subject to harassment, arbitrary detention, prison sentences, and torture during the last 4 decades, during the life of the Islamic regime in Iran. For what reason? Only for practicing their faith. The regime's security forces attack house churches. Christian converts are subject to horrible treatment. They face death penalty. So the Iranian Sunnis and Baha'is, they are also discriminated against, and they face the most brutal persecution. And as you mentioned, universities under the government's direction, they refuse to admit Baha'i students. Security forces destroy Baha'i cemeteries. They confiscate their properties. The last case was just happened a few days ago, that the security forces confiscated the property of Baha'is in a particular village. They have been suffering from the most horrific forms of repression and persecution. Well, people may want to know why this regime in Iran is so obsessed with religious minorities. The reason is that the Islamic regime in Iran reflects the radical Shia theology of Ayatollah Khomeini, which is known as Neo-Shiism or Khomeinism, which basically tries to create a sort of a pure version of Islamic state, a pure version of Islamic society that is ruled by Vilayat Faqih. The view of religious minorities in Khomeinism or in Neo-Shiism is really miserable. Jews and Christians, they were considered by traditional Shiism as dhimmi. They were protected second-class citizens. But in the New Shiism, they are considered, in New Shiism, Baha'is and Jews and Christians and other religious minorities, they are considered to be unclean. They are unclean that pollute the body of Islam. So Jews also fared no better. They have been routinely compared to apes and to pigs. So Khomeini borrowed a lot of his anti-Semitic themes from Sayyid Qutb and from the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, which also were heavily influenced by the Nazi Germany. So this view of Khomeini basically resulted in a broader enmity against the Judeo-Christians and other religious minorities like Baha'is. And this hatred basically became the actual policy of the Iranian regime after the Islamic Revolution. Tens of thousands of Iranian Jews and Christians and Baha'is fled Iran to save their life. So the regime's strategy with regards to Christians and Jews is clear. It's eliminationism. And that's a strategy to shrink the size of these religious minorities. Eliminationism is the other face of genocide. We know that genocide involves the murder of a minority group, but eliminationism is basically designed to push the minority out of the country. So eliminationism and genocide are the two sides of the same coin. And this strategy is basically not limited to Iran only. The Iranian regime has pushed this eliminationism strategy through its proxy militias in neighboring countries, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, and in Yemen. In some of these countries, Christian population had decreased to a catastrophically low levels. The truth is that, Brian, the Iranian regime presents a serious challenge, and this challenge needs to be addressed. The international community needs to view the Iranian challenge as not just a nuclear file. The human rights should be at the center of any policy with regards to Iran. Unfortunately, the Biden administration has no plan of action to counter this regime and to counter the challenges it presents. Even there are reports that Biden administration has already lifted some of the sanctions, and the administration is ready to do more for a watered down version of the JCPOA. This will only embolden the Iranian regime, and lifting sanctions on this regime will only enable this regime to channel more funds to its proxies, which are engaged in harassing religious minorities, harassing Christians and Jews in the region. And it will enable it to channel more funds to destabilizing the region and to accelerate its missile program, to accelerate and to develop weapon system against Israel and other US allies.
Yeah, those are all fantastic points, and the one thing that I would like to add to that before we shift to the next topic here is that the Iranian regime certainly since 1979, Doctor, they've stayed pretty close to their playbook, and over the years, it looks like the Iranian people have grown even farther away from the regime, and it's very important to draw a line in the sand. I think it's very important to draw a line in the sand between the Iranian people and the Iranian regime. The Iranian regime, yeah, exactly, and the Iranian people, they're desperate, for freedom, for liberty. They're desperate, to be able to have warm relationships, with their neighbors. So it's very important that we always make that point, and I know you agree with me.
Absolutely, I totally agree. Yes.
So let's shift to our next question, and thank you for giving that fantastic analysis of what ethnic and religious minorities what they face inside of the Islamic Republic. Now, for the next question, let's talk a little bit about the track record of the Islamic Republic. and the track record of arresting citizens on trumped up charges that, lead to forced confessions and, unfortunately, very public executions. One of the most high profile cases in recent years where this happened was Naveed Afkari.
Oh, yes.
Naveed was a famous Olympic wrestler. He was loved by all throughout the country. Right. And he, like millions of Iranians, he participated in peaceful protests that have happened over the years throughout the Islamic Republic. Now, once the Islamic Republic identified that he was, in fact, part of these protests, they immediately arrested him on what we believe and what the banner share of Iranian people believe to be false charges. They then tortured him until a false confession was made, and then they executed him in a very public way. So while many have heard of this case because of Mr. Afkari's high profile, this is the same tactic that is used, sadly, by the Islamic Republic on, what feels like a daily, weekly, monthly basis on their citizens. And unfortunately, I don't think the American people really ever hear too much about it. So, Dr. Rezaei, please give us your perspective on this brutal tactic that's used by the Islamic Republic to censor, oppress, and eventually murder their own citizens.
Brian, thank you very much for this important question. Well, torture and forced confessions of political detainees have been systematic and continuous in Iran under the Islamic regime from day one, from 1979 up to now. The state television, the IRIB, has been broadcasting the tortured confessions of at least 360 people over the last decade to suppress political dissent and political activists in Iran. And the state television is doing this on behalf of the security services. Political prisoners are being forced into reading from a whiteboard, and the correspondents from the state TV ordered them how to do it in a way that it doesn't look like the confession is being made by force. But political prisoners, those who experienced this horrible act, they later said that they were beaten and they were tortured to confess. Even they were threatened with sexual violence to make false testimonies. So these tapes, resemblance to recantation tapes that were produced in Stalin Russia during 1935-39 Moscow trials, and in Maoist China during the brainwashing campaign, they are exactly similar in language and in format. Of course, the Iranian regime is just a little more creative. That's why now it's the #1 producer of these sort of shows in the world. Exactly like the Stalin's Moscow trials and like the Maoist brainwashing campaign, the Islamic regime coerced prisoners to humiliate themselves, to dehumanize themselves, and to demonize themselves, and to repeat exactly the accusation by the regime. So this way, the Iranian regime wants to depict them as criminals. It wants to depict them as traitors. Stalin and Mao also wanted political prisoners to confess to subverting the positive values of society. The goal was to devastate the opposition by demoralize them and by depoliticize them. The Iranian regime has the same objective. It has the same objective. They consider confession as the best evidence of guilt. And then once they confess, it would be easier for the regime to execute them. This has been the case since the Islamic regime came to power in 1979 up to now. At the beginning of the revolution, the Iranian revolutionaries did this to the member of the Tudeh party, for example, and some other groups as well. And the state television aired their confessions. And Interestingly enough, some of the tapes were previewed by Ayatollah Khomeini himself before being aired. So now, about the death penalty. The Iranian regime is the leading implementer of the death penalty. The regime has executed people for maharaba, or enmity against God, or ifsad fil arz, that's sowing corruption on earth, and also the regime executes people on espionage charge. So these are all false charges fabricated by the security services, and confessions are all made under the torture. This is one common way that authoritarian regimes try to silence critics and dissidents and political opponents. To tell you what, Stalin was able to successfully eliminate his critics and political rivals in this way during the late 1930s, during the Great Purge. And the Islamic regime in Iran is also using the same tactic. The regime is the world's #1 for the execution per capita. In 2018, I have some numbers to share with you now and with our audience. In 2018, the Iranian regime executed 253 people. In 2020, it executed 250 people. In 2021, executed 266 people. And many of these people were journalists, were political activists, were minors, and ethnic and religious and sexual minorities and women. Most of these executions were carried out secretly and even without the knowledge of the families of those executed people. So the Iranian regime is also #1 in execution, #1 in the world, and in execution of women and children. In 2021, only 9 women and 2 children were executed secretly. And then since 1990s up to 2005, 34 children were executed secretly. In 2014 alone, 13 children were executed. From 2014 to 2017, the regime executed 25 children. And in 2018, 12 children were executed. And up to now that we are speaking at this panel, 90 children remain on death row. So these terrible and barbaric acts need an immediate stop. President Biden should put human rights at the center of his foreign policy and the US-Iran policy to address this horrible issue.
Well, it's very tough to hear those numbers, and to think that there are or even just one child that has been executed, let alone now 90, I believe I heard you say, that are on death row. What could 90 children possibly have done wrong as a child for them to be sitting on death row, other than the fact that they're a religious minority, an ethnic minority, or don't come from the right family? It's so tough and difficult to hear you talk about that, and coupled with the fact that just 2 years ago, last month, there was the Bloody November, where thousands, at least 1,500 Iranian citizens were publicly executed, mowed down with machine gun fire all throughout the country for peacefully protesting. So it's just so clear to you, to me, I think to a lot of our viewers, that the Islamic Republic has a very strong track record of censoring, oppressing, and murdering their own citizens. And I really appreciate your call to action to President Biden, because he really, if he is so insistent on engaging in diplomacy with the Islamic Republic. It sure would be nice if he led with human rights, but we haven't really heard too much about human rights, unfortunately.
That's right, and that's very unfortunate. Yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you for taking us through all of that, and certainly was tough to hear, but it had to be said, and that's something that we have really, we pride ourselves at IAL, and that sometimes we're going to say things that a lot of other people are afraid to say, but it's the truth and it has to be said. So thank you for speaking up on that. So let's shift to our next question here. And let's talk about the Abraham Accords. The signing of the Abraham Accords ushered in a transformation in the relationship between Israel and so many of the world's Arab nations, with the United States strong bipartisan support in the United States. And over the course of just 4 short months between August and December of 2020, 4 countries followed Egypt and Jordan's bold leadership and moved to initiate diplomatic process to normalize bilateral ties with Israel. In signing these agreements, the United States, the UAE, Bahrain, and Israel, shortly followed by Kosovo, Sudan, and Morocco, signaled a new era of warm peace and prosperity, with unlimited economic opportunities and societal opportunities as well. While the Abraham Accords have shown the world that peace between Jews and Muslims is possible, the Islamic Republic and a lot of their allies in the United States, such as Trita Parsi and the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, have attacked anyone that publicly supports the Abraham Accords. In fact, Trita has personally attacked me on multiple occasions for my support of Israel and my support of the Abraham Accords. So with that said, I want to ask you this. Why do you think the Islamic Republic and their lobbyists and their mouthpieces in the United States are so nervous about this progress that's been made in a very short period of time because of the Abraham Accords?
Thank you very much, Brian. This is a great question. Well, first of all, the Islamic regime in Iran is the most aggressive and dangerous player in the Middle East. Iran is behind most of the turmoil in this troubled region. For its entire life, the Iranian regime has been trying to destabilize the region, and now the Abraham Accord represent a significant paradigm shift, a strategic shift, and a fundamental change in the visions, interests, priorities, and threats among the countries in this region. So the Abraham Accord is a significant achievement for peace and prosperity in this troubled region. That's about the Abraham Accord. So, and then the Abraham Accord basically improves Israel's strategic position and its response to the challenges it faces from Iran. And also, let's not forget that the primary motive for the Abraham Accord is the shared regional threat from the Iranian regime, right? So the countries party to the Abraham Accord cooperate with each other towards enhancing stability, development, and prosperity in the Middle East. And the goal is to counter Iran's negative influence in the region. So now, to get back to your question that why the Islamic regime in Iran is so nervous about the Abraham Accord, I would say because the Abraham Accords will strengthen the axis of moderation and stability in the region. The Abraham Accord basically represent a serious roadblock to Iran's regional hegemony, and it represents a serious barrier to Iran's destabilizing policies. So it's normal for a bad actor like the Iranian regime that is bound to continue with its destabilization to feel anxious about the Abraham Accord. This is something normal. So it's for this reason that the Iranian regime tries to, for example, tries to drive a wedge between Israel and other countries party to the Abraham Accord. Israel now, more than any time in history, is important to the security of the United States. Now that America is in retreat from the Middle East, Israel is the only country who can provide security guarantee to the countries that are party to the Abraham Accord and are American allies. So these countries need a defensive umbrella against Iran, and Israel is the only country in the region who can provide this security guarantee to the American allies. But one thing is important and can be counterproductive, and that's the US return to the JCPOA, which would probably damage the Abraham Accord because of number of reasons. For example, first of all, regional countries may try to form a parallel relationship with Iran in case of US return to the JCPOA. And if that happens, the Iranian regime will want Arab countries to slow pace of their normalization with Israel. And this way, the Iranian regime tries to prevent Israel's military and intelligence presence in the region. And second of all, the return to the JCPOA will enable the Iranian regime to increase its negative influence in the Middle East, and this will deter other countries, other parties to the Abraham Accord from effectively confronting the Iranian regime.
So I think you made several good points there, and one of the points that I want to add on to is the fact that, you know, anytime you hear the Islamic Republic talking about Israel, it's always, you know, very negative things related to Zionism and calling them Zionist scum, you know, and things like this. And what I think is really interesting about the Abraham Accords is if you look at the Kingdom of Morocco, for example, the Kingdom of Morocco has literally scrubbed out any anti-Israel or anti-Zionist language from their textbooks, and they're replacing it with Holocaust education, history about the Jewish people, history about Israel. And I would think something like that really scares the Islamic Republic because it's very much changing you know, the conversation and the future. Just to use Morocco, for example, the youth of Morocco are not going to grow up being brainwashed that Israel is the enemy. They're actually going to learn the opposite. They're going to learn, you know, what Israel has done and how they've contributed to society. And that's a game changer. That's a really,
it's a paradigm shift in the region. So up to now, the Arab countries saw Israel as their number one enemy, but they realized that no, they are wrong. The number one enemy is the Iranian regime. So this is a paradigm shift in the Arab world, that number one enemy is actually the Iranian regime with its policies, with its effort to obtain nuclear weapon, with its effort to expand its ballistic missile program, and with its effort to destabilize the entire Middle East through its proxy forces.
Yeah, fantastic point. So we're going to shift to our last question here, and we're going to build on this conversation that we're having about the Abraham Accords. So, you know, countries such as the UAE and Morocco, the Kingdom of Morocco, you know, they're evolving and they're becoming more tolerant of religious minorities, ethnic minorities, while also providing women with more opportunities than ever before. Just earlier this week, Israel's prime minister met with a female minister from the United Arab Emirates. 10 years ago, I don't think any of us could have imagined that day would happen, but it did. It happened, and it didn't happen. I think the biggest point maybe to make here is it didn't happen behind the scenes in the cloak of darkness. It happened for the whole world to see. And there's tons of pictures, there's tons of video, both from Israel and the UAE, that have pushed that out there for the world to see, how things have changed in the UAE. So, but meanwhile, the Islamic Republic's women, labor force participation rate, is the lowest in the world. Women are systematically kept out of the workforce in the Islamic Republic. So the question is this: why, in your opinion, why won't the Islamic Republic take some steps to reform their nation, like so many, of their neighbors, from the UAE to Turkey, to even Saudi Arabia is taking steps to reform their country? So why won't the Islamic Republic do the same?
Good question, Brian. Thank you. Well, I think I already mentioned that hatred of religious minorities basically roots in new Shiism, which is also known as Khomeiniism, which basically tries to create a pure Islamic state, a pure Islamic society that is ruled by Vilayat al-Faqih. And this hatred is basically translated into actual policy, right? I believe as long as this regime is in power in Iran, we should not expect any change in its vision towards religious minorities. And as I mentioned earlier, mistreatment of women basically represents a fundamental component of the regime's religious authorities, right? So when you talk about reform and normalization of the Iranian regime, that basically means the end of this regime. So there is no way that this regime can be reformed. No way. You could not change. I mean, think about it. In the other ideologies, like communism, they were not reformable. And the Iranian regime knows well that the moment that they want to just move ahead with little reform, that would be the end of them. They have the experience of the Soviet Union. Other ideologies also were not reformable. Fascism was not reformable. Nazism was not reformable. The Iranian regime's ideology, or Khomeinism, is not any different. So the moment that you talk about reform in Islamic revolution, I would think about the fact that that would be the end of this regime. I mean, there is no way that this regime can be reformed. The only way that we can have a different Iran is just a regime change in Iran. I don't see any other way around.
Yeah, and to add to that point, it's also been very interesting that there's so many of the regime's mouthpieces here in the U.S. That went to lengths to try and paint the previous president Rouhani as a reformist. And what I find to be, what I find to be very interesting about that is, under a so-called reformist, 1,500 Iranian citizens were killed to quell an uprising. So,
right.
It's interesting how people, really, have these perspectives. And, I don't think the perspectives, kind of much like the Iranian regime, I don't think they're based on reality. Right. That is, those are the questions that we had for you. And Dr. Rezaei, it's been an absolute honor and pleasure.
It's all mine, Brian. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Of course. And, I'm so thankful, that you spent this time with us, and, for taking the time to share your expertise with our community. And before we officially wrap up here, I'd like to give you the floor to wrap up with some closing remarks, and really anything that you'd like to share with our audience.
Well, I would like to say this is a message for Biden administration that human rights issue should be at the center of his policy and at the center of his Iran's policy. It should not be ignored. This is a serious challenge, and Biden administration should address this. Iran is not just only a nuclear file. Iran presents a lot of challenges. Its ballistic missile program is a big challenge. Its nuclear program is a big challenge. Its regional and foreign policies are a big challenge, and also the human rights issue is a big challenge. So human rights should not be sacrificed for just only nuclear program and nuclear negotiation. This is a call not just only to Biden administration, but to all world powers, that the human rights issue and the violation of human rights by the Iranian regime is a serious one. Violation of the rights of religious minorities, including Christians, Jews, and Baha'is, are serious, and the Biden administration and other world powers who are engaged in negotiation with Iran over the nuclear program should also address this issue.
My pleasure and our pleasure. Again, thank you, Dr. Rezaei, for making the time to connect with the Iranian American community, and for those very powerful closing remarks. And thank you to all of you for tuning in to this discussion. Now, as I mentioned at the top of the conversation, this is IAL's last event of 2021.
Oh, really?
Yeah, this is our last event. We've been relatively busy this year.
I'm lucky that I'm here.
Well, I would say that we are the lucky ones. But throughout this year, we've produced now over 25 high quality events with members of Congress, foreign policy experts, human rights experts, and you, the Iranian American community. We've done this to give you a platform as well to tell your stories. And I just want to say to everyone that's watching live with us and will watch the recording, I want you to know that it's been a tremendous honor and pleasure for me to lead this organization. And I really am just so thankful and blessed to have, all of your support. And as we look forward to 2022, our organization has some very exciting new projects that we're going to be announcing once we get into the new year. And we also have several new events being planned with members of Congress, with foreign policy experts, and other individuals. So until we see you again in 2022, wishing all of our viewers a happy holidays, a happy new year. And Dr. Rezaei, thank you again for making this time to be with us. It's really been an honor to have your perspective here today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone. Have a great end of the year.